Well, hello, I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asian Society. Welcome to our original content series, which is Asian Americans Building America. We call it ABBA, and that's despite a famous Swedish pop group with a similar name. We're speaking with many Asian Americans across the United States with unique backgrounds and who are making a deep impact in their community, across the country and across the globe. And today we're joined by Rajika Bhandari, an education expert, founder, and author of 6 publications, including her latest book, America Calling, a Foreign Student in a Country of Possibility. So, Rajika, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. It's a real honor.
That's good. And tell us about your background. Where's your family from? How long you've been in the United States? All that sort of stuff. We're always interested in these programs about the family story.
So I'm originally from India, and I've now been in the US for, I think close to about 28 years. And I've been very much part of one part of the Indian immigrant story to the US, which is really coming to the US as a foreign student or international student, and then staying on and becoming an Indian American immigrant. So that's sort of been part of my personal journey in kind of joining the very large Indian diaspora here in the US. And during that time, I've crisscrossed. I started my journey in North Carolina, which I refer to as my original home in the US. That's where I landed. That's where I went to university, and then moved back and forth between the East Coast and California, and then back in the New York area.
That's great. Well, it's such a huge diaspora, Indian diaspora in the United States, and I've been privileged to meet so many of them making extraordinary contributions to American life. We'll get to your book in a moment, but tell us about your podcast, Ed Up Worldwide Podcast. Sounds fascinating. What's Ed Up seek to do?
Well, I'm so glad you asked about that, because it is a new podcast that I launched about 4 months ago. And interestingly enough, your predecessor, Dr. Vishaka Desai, was one of the first guests on it. But the podcast really grew out of my book, which I know we'll talk about shortly. But it grew out of this idea that we really need to have more conversations about how education really serves as a catalyst or a link between the US and other countries around the world, and that when we look at migrants and immigrants and really the cultural fabric of the US to which immigrants have contributed, very often education sits at the heart of that. So that's what the podcast is about. I have a range of guests, right from scholars to book authors. We've had filmmakers who are Fulbright fellows, musicians, and a range of other people. But at the heart of it is this idea of how an educational experience can really help foster diplomacy and understanding.
That's great. I'm glad you had Vishaka on, because she is a phenomenal font of wisdom in terms of the importance of education and culture in, frankly, re-altering our collective hardwiring and mindsets. And it's so critical. And now tell us about your book, America Calling. Is it optimistic? Is it a call to action to keep America's borders open? Tell us what the core argument is.
So that's a good question. It is optimistic. It certainly ends on an optimistic note. But the book grows out of my professional work over the past 20 years, where I've been in the space of being a scholar and practitioner, of studying how foreign students, how international students and scholars cross borders to obtain an education, and how higher education is often a pathway to immigration in the countries in which these individuals have studied. So I've spent the past 20 years studying these trends, but it's also been a lived experience for me, because as I shared with you, I came to the US as an international student, a foreign student from India. And then by a twist of fate, lo and behold, a couple of decades later, or well, about 15 years later, found myself in the role of suddenly being on the other side of having become a scholar studying these trends. And over time, I have come to realize through my work how deep that connection is between, again, that higher education pathway and immigrant America, or you're from Australia and you know the value of international education and immigrants. So the call to action in the book is really that it's a very strong argument for keeping the doors of universities and countries open to global talent from around the world, to having friendlier immigration policies that would enable this talent to be and pursue their dreams wherever they want to. So that's what the book is about.
Fantastic. Tell us about racism. What's your experience? You've been in the United States 28 years. Firstly, as a scholar, but also then you personally, have you experienced a trend line? What are you observing? And frankly, have you also experienced manifestation of it yourself, personally or professionally? Back to you.
So the way I've experienced it, and I actually talk about this in the book, I refer to it as a triple cumulative disadvantage, where what I felt for myself, and I'm sure many others like me, that you're sort of dealing with sort of three strikes against you. You're visibly foreign, you sound foreign, and you come or you belong to a racial and ethnic group that within the US is a minority group and has certain stereotypes associated with it. So I think that for me, through my years of living in the US, I think it's sort of being subject to certain stereotypes about the Indian American community. I would say that a lot of it is also tied to, of course, skin color. So I have personally not encountered as much racism because, again, Indians are of varying skin colors. But certainly I think that, there was a lot that happened after 9/11, where a lot of international students, where a lot of, as you probably know, Indians who were Sikhs and others were, the focus of hate crimes. But I think that, I would say that for me, it's sort of those three pieces of kind of being a woman, being sort of visibly foreign and sounding foreign that often sort of, really become a barrier. They become a barrier.
So in your professional life, I get different answers to this question depending on who I'm speaking to through this ABBA series. Have people given you a hard time at any stage because of your Indian origins, because of the way you speak or all that sort of stuff? Or has it been very much at the margins? So I'm kind of always interested in this.
I think it's definitely affected me. But again, it's something that's a gray area where one can't pinpoint, there's no clear evidence. But during my educational and professional journey in the US, I've certainly been through those points where job offers were rescinded, or I was offered a very low-balled, low-salary offer, which made me pause and wonder that what is the combination of factors that is leading this to happen? Is it because, again, I'm foreign, I'm immigrant? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm a person of color? Or is it really an intersection of all of those things? And I think that's very much part of the conversation that we are having in the US today around the intersectionality of race, of gender, and other factors. So again, no evidence, but I would say I've certainly had my ups and downs. And it was really only when I moved to New York about 18 years ago and began to work in a truly global and international setting and in the field of international education that I felt that I could feel comfortable in my own skin because I was surrounded by people who themselves were extremely global, where either they were originally from another country or they had studied abroad or they had a spouse who was from another culture and country.
Yeah, I've got to say, I'm in New York as a foreigner myself, albeit an Anglo, as you can see. It is remarkable in terms of the international quality of its set of cultural assumptions, and not necessarily, therefore, the norm across the rest of the United States. It must have been pretty rough having a job offer withdrawn. And my experience of those sort of things and observation of them is that white guys are often pretty clever about the way they can mask that. In other words, act in a particular way, which I would judge as being racist, but then advance a series of other reasons as to why it may not have been. So, but you obviously picked yourself up and dusted yourself off after that one. You strike me as being enormously resilient.
I think that's very much part of, I would say, every immigrant's experience. And if there's one thing we know about immigrants in most societies is that it's a very rough road. Immigration policies and laws are often not friendly. And those who come out at the other end, I mean, I characterize it as a trial by fire. But if there's one thing we know about immigrants, it is that they are resilient and their experiences have made them so.
Absolutely. So on the question of identity, are you proud to be an American, an Asian American, an Indian American? How do you see yourself 28 years on in this country?
I think it's always going to be a hyphenated identity. So I'll start by saying that because, we tend to think that it'll get easier, that one will assimilate or integrate more into one's adopted country, but that's not necessarily the case. So I feel that for me, that sort of bifurcation or having those dual identities will just always be a part of who I am. But to your question, I think of myself as primarily Indian American. I think more recently, especially with everything that's happened around the broader Asian American community in the US, I do think that it's led to more of an allegiance between the Indian American community and the broader Asian American community, which is often sort of typified as those of East Asian origin. And I think South Asians have sort of often felt left out or either left out or not having necessarily embraced that label. But I think that's begun to shift in the past few years because there is that recognition of sort of a shared sense of marginalization along racial lines, whether it's South Asia or East Asia. And sort of, again, I think the common denominator is really that shared immigrant experience that brings those different groups together. But I'll just share that when I first arrived in the US, I was very, very confused. And again, this is something I talk about in the book because every time Americans referred to Asian or Asia or Asian Americans, for the most part, it was East Asia or to some extent Southeast Asia. But South Asia was sort of left out of that conversation entirely. And my hope is that that's changed now and it has begun to shift.
Final question. What advice do you have for future generations of Indian Americans, young men, young women arriving in this country? So when they encounter hate or they encounter softer forms of racism or any other form of racism, what advice do you give them in how they pursue their American dream?
So you might be surprised with what I'll say to that. So I think there are two parts to this, and we've seen this play out in recent years because I do a lot of work with international students who are arriving in the US, and as we know, most of them come from China and India. And I think one part of that self-education is really understanding the social and racial fabric of the society that you're about to enter. And many Indian students do not have that understanding. And I will say quite bluntly, there is a great deal of racism within the Indian American community. And even back in India, we may not refer to it as race. We may refer to it as caste. But certainly there's a lot of discrimination along color lines, which people coming to the US often carry with them. So I think that's one side of the coin of really educating themselves about America's racial history and understanding better the society that they're about to arrive in. And currently, that's a huge gap. But the reverse of it is also beginning to understand where do they sit, again, in that racial fabric of society, and embracing that more. Because over the years, what I've noticed is on campuses and even in the wider community, there's this sense of, well, we're Indian Americans and they're the rest, and these are their problems, not our problems. But I think, again, that's begun to shift in recent years. So my advice, learn about the country, its culture and history that you're about to go to, but also think about sort of where you sit in all of those politics and conversations.
Wise words. Rajika Bhandari, thank you so much for amplifying the voices of Asian Americans and international students. Your work as an educator, a founder, podcast host and author is helping America's calling to fulfill the American dream. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm from the Asian Society, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kevin.